Welcome to Second Look Education. I'm Amy.
And I'm Candace.
We're educators examining what's really happening in classrooms, policy, and teacher preparation. When joy is treated as optional, when professional judgment is replaced by scripts, and when compliance is mistaken for quality, both teachers and children pay the cost.
This podcast is our refusal to normalize that. Are we educating for compliance or for a future of educated critical thinkers?
That question drives everything we do. Each episode starts with a real moment from education, something observed, experienced, or encountered that made us pause and ask, what's actually going on here?
We dig into the complexity, we reject false binaries, and we refuse to pretend that what we're seeing is sustainable. This is Second Look Education.
Welcome back to Second Look Education Podcast. Today we're taking a second look with a moment Candace is bringing to us.
Hi, welcome back. Okay, so my second look relates both personally and professionally. So my niece, who's now 8, back when she was 7 and they were just formalizing learning how to read, I asked her if she was excited to learn to read and if she was loving school, and she said to me, "No, I don't like reading." And it was just so matter of fact. There was no like anger or resentment or like emotion. It was just like, "No, I don't like it." And I just remember feeling like devastated, first of all, because I love to read.
Yeah.
And obviously, I love learning and everything around that. And reading is tied to all that. And, I know as kids get older, they tend not to like school or reading as much, but this is a magical time. This is her first learning how to read. You get to, these things, these notes that get passed, you get to see them. And this is how learning is established. And she just, matter of fact, "No, I don't like it." It's gotten a little bit better since then. But what does it mean when a 6 or 7-year-old who's just learning how to read already says they don't like reading? They already don't like school. What are we doing? What are we doing that this is becoming more and more so the norm? It stayed with me, obviously, because as an educator, I always wanted my students to love to read. I feel like reading opens the doors for all types of learning, and it's, the catalyst for all of that. And it's such a magical time. It's a way to escape. It's a way to see the world through different eyes. And so, the curiosity that builds around it, thinking from like a perspective, like, what is happening in the classroom, what's the design that isn't, tying to that. And as a principal, like just thinking about my role in the system, what role did I play, and did I encourage, fostering this more of a love of learning, this joy that comes from learning. And then tied to research, how whole child development, the way students learn, how we build curiosity, the significance of reading and all these things. And so all of these things surfaced, and it really built for me like that we've normalized something that should feel unacceptable. We ask children what they know. We mark them at these benchmarks where they're supposed to be, but we never ask them about learning, how it feels to them, or if they want to keep learning, or even tell them why they're learning. We talk about these standards that we throw up on boards, and I will learn, and I will be able to, and all these things, but like, why are you really learning this, right? So I think for me, it's what's happening that we've lost this like magical time of joy of learning itself.
Yeah, that curiosity, happiness.
Yeah. And children are born naturally curious, especially in those beginning years. You think about just even infants when they find their toes in their hands, that's a form of learning, or the rapid brain development that happens in those few years, that everything is happening at once and they're learning without even realizing it, but they're curious, they're naturally asking questions, they're naturally exploring. And so, what happens with this, the flow state theory speaks to learning being if it's meaningful and appropriate, with challenge, then children get into this flow state of learning.
Right, but flow takes time.
Yes.
Right.
Yes.
I've done a little reading with Csikszentmihalyi, who is the flow theory man, and that comes from his work with art students. I think it was in Chicago, University of Chicago, maybe, but he did research with art students at the university, and would observe them doing their work, right? And he would observe them in these flow states, and that As soon as they were done with a project, it would just like go to the back of the room. Like it didn't matter. What mattered was being in that state of complete flow, where they feel like that's where like time disappears, right?
Yeah.
You don't realize that you're working for hours and hours
Yeah.
because you're just in it. And are there opportunities for kids to do that in schools, right? Like we're often saying we don't have enough time for that. We don't have enough time for that, right? We have to get through this. So yeah, when I've read about flow and how important it is for us to feel connected to what we're working on and doing, but there aren't really spaces for that in our schools.
Exactly. And that builds onto that like meaningful component, right? The meaningful connection to learning and finding those interests. I know that learning is not always easy. That's not what we're saying. I always tell our pre-service teachers challenging but achievable. That's the goal, challenging but achievable. We have to be challenged. We have to fail.
Zone of proximal
Yes,
development,
yes,
right?
exactly. That zone of proximal development but we have to be challenged and we have to make mistakes because that's how we learn. No matter how old we are, you don't ever figure that out. There has to be ability to make those mistakes and time to grow from those mistakes. This whole concept of joy in learning, these gaps get larger as students get older. I know I've mentioned my own children and especially my son and his friends, they just like absolutely hate school and the idea of going on. And I mean, I think there's a lot of things that contributed to like, we talked about like the pandemic and that sort of thing, but this like whole concept of just like naturally hating school. This deeper question. So what are we teaching children about learning itself? Are we even teaching anything about learning itself? We're teaching them how to read, but not why they're reading. There is some pushback, but it's not happening till like older years where it's like, hey, books are essential. They speak wisdom into the world. And why do you think books get banned? And why do you think those are the first things that are burned when we talk about history or, erasure and all of that? So like to actually teach them what learning feels like, get excited about it.
Because from your kind of perspective, it's more skills based versus meaning based. Yeah.
And I think in those early years, the freedom to learn, but also like understanding why reading is so important. It's become like we're supposed to be able to read, and this is when you read this and this is when you do this. But like why? Why is reading so important? And unless you've never had the opportunity to learn to read, you don't necessarily understand how significant and powerful.
Freire,
Yeah.
critical pedagogy,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
Learning is liberation, reading is liberation.
Yes.
Yeah.
So this leans into like I've really gotten into this like concept of joy in school. And so we've normalized joyless school. And I don't think this is the solution. I know there's a lot of systemic issues, but even for teachers, if they do not have joy in their instruction, then I think it filters into the learning for the students.
How could it not?
Yes. And so like, what do I mean by joy? I am a huge fan of the work of Goldie Muhammad. You know this, I talk about her all the time. And there's two quotes where she talks about joy in one of her books. And joy is the ultimate goal of teaching and learning, not test prep or graduation. Joy is much more than having fun or expressing happiness in the moment. It is a sustained sense of fulfillment and happiness. Joy is not temporary, it is sustaining, long-lasting form of happiness, self-liberation, and self-beauty in the mind and the heart. So, like, what do you hear? What do you hear when you think of that in the classroom?
Oh, what I didn't hear was make your lessons fun.
Yeah.
So, and I think that's bigger because
Yes.
that distinction, because when we think about joy, or when I say to a teacher, anybody, do you have joy in school? Is school a joyful thing? It's like, well, I had fun when I did this thing, and that's really not what she's saying,
No.
right? It's much more about identity and intellect and challenge, but being in a safe space, right? Where you have opportunities to connect with others, but who you are is important, and what you bring to school is valued.
Yes.
And different.
Yes. And it's this, I mean, she literally said it's a sustaining, long-lasting form of happiness, self-liberation, and self-beauty in the mind and the heart. And, this, I think about self-liberation, and this is like that empowerment through knowledge. And, yes, in that moment, maybe you did have fun or had happiness, but it's this like sustaining. I think it's for me, what I relate this to at our ages and levels is like when you and I get really excited to talk about a topic.
Yeah.
And it's because it's learning and we're building on knowledge and it's serving a purpose. And so that's something that I really hold true when I even teach our pre-service teachers, even online where I find it a little more difficult. I want this for our students because then they can carry it into their future classrooms.
It seems like it's also, to me, I get this like feeling, like I can feel when there's joy in a classroom or in a school. And I can tell you that because I go into a lot of
Yeah.
classrooms, and some of them you walk into and it feels like a family. It
Yeah.
feels like everybody has a voice and that they're comfortable with each other and they're free to like move and speak and be. That's different than in very structured and almost clinical, standardized classrooms. So I think joy does have this feeling,
Yeah.
essence to
Well,
it.
and I think that's schools that have their own identity. And when you said that, I immediately thought about where I was a principal when I first went there to interview. And I immediately was like, there's a feeling here, even when things were difficult, just this identity, this sense of joy. And I had also interviewed at a different school, completely different location. And I remember walking into that interview and immediately being like, oh, like this isn't for me.
Yeah.
And I went through the interview and I walked out, and the person in charge of running the interviews was like, "Oh, that was really quick. You were very quick with your answers." I'm like, "Well, just getting to the point." But like for me, I was like, I wasn't going to be rude and walk in and be like, "I have a feeling this isn't a good fit." But there is that sense, and I was like, I'm just not feeling it. But in that other position, I had felt it, and I still, even visiting, I still feel it there. Additionally, I think about Edward Deci and Richard Ryan and some of their research around the human beings and their motivation to learn and the conditions that are applied there. And three of those conditions are autonomy, competence, and connection, which tied to self-determination theory. What I find interesting about those is in my teacher empowerment research, when I really talked about when teachers feel empowered in the classroom, they're very similar. That autonomy, competence, and connection, they run simultaneously. So if teachers are able to feel that way, then perhaps they can bring that more into their classrooms as well. And then just coming back to this concept of children are not born disengaged. Like they are not born unmotivated. They have this natural intrinsic interest
Take
in
a
doing.
small child anywhere.
Yes.
Right? They can't keep their hands off of things. They can't stop talking to everyone, right?
All the whys.
Yeah.
The whys, the
Right.
whys, the whys. So if we're already at 6 and 7 and we're discussing a dislike for school, there's something disrupting that natural drive. Are we leaning more into that compliance model, right? We keep coming back to that. I mean, that's our overarching question. Sit still, do the worksheet, stay on pace, hit the benchmark. One of the first things I do in one of my classes is for the teachers that are just entering the program is what is one lesson that you remember from like as far back as you can? And none of them are like, I loved the time math worksheets. This one time my teacher gave me this really cool handout, or we got a lecture. It's none of those. It's always these like engaging, enriching, I learned so much from kind of lessons. And that's what I hope they're carrying with them. Peter Gray also talked about that when learning is controlled externally, it shifts from joyful into something that feels like work. And so one of the quotes that really stood out to me was, anything a person is forced to do according to someone else's schedule using procedures that someone dictates is work. The very act of taking control of children's learning turns that learning from joy into work. This is such a powerful quote, and it really gave me a full perspective on schooling. And then I was like, where's the balance for this too? Because, you know, we're not going to completely flip this system into this like self-driven students just,
Come on.
it's not that easy. But how do we kind of look at that and really think about how we might be stifling students? And we know that learning does involve effort, but how do we bring in that joy and that healthy challenge so that students want to be challenged and have that effort?
This reminds me of, so the external control, like curriculum and standards, right? They drive instruction, yeah. But of Goldie Muhammad's metaphor about the ball gown, about the ball gown being the curriculum, being designed without ever taking the child's measurements, right? And then when it doesn't fit, we blame the child. Yeah, so that metaphor I think is really powerful, but
it's
it
very
really talks
powerful.
about the design process in what we do in school, right? How we design our days and our curriculum, and however your grade level or classroom has to run. But are we taking who the children are at this and during this school year into consideration? And so something I was thinking about as I was preparing for this was an assignment that we do with our field candidates in their later kind of field work. Is this, they have these funds of identity, funds of knowledge logbooks. And so what they do with those is they're supposed to kind of pay attention to the kids that are in these classrooms that they're working with, and pay attention to things that they talk about and things that they share about themselves, things they like to do, things they notice about them, and they record these things in their notebooks. Like they go to play restaurant during recess, right? Or they like to talk about animals, or they have pets, or responsibilities they have at home, things they do on the weekends, stuff like that. And so things that they would normally overlook, right? Because they're not tied to anything academic. And we have them start noticing those things. And from the noticing, then what we want them to do is interpret these things. So what does a kid having to, go to his grandma's after school every day, what does that mean for you as the teacher? Did you learn anything about that child's responsibilities or their home life? And then how can you then use that information in your classroom? And so it's that middle step that most of the work is, right? It's like taking this thing that the kid tells you about, or that you notice about them, like, oh, they all gather with these toys over here when I take them out. Well, what do you notice about those toys? And how can I interpret that and use that to both my advantage, but the kids' advantage as well? It's that these are like these small like entryways into their lives and learning. But I don't think that teachers are necessarily trained in those ways. And the other thing is, like, it doesn't automatically interrupt, like, oh, now we don't do curriculum, but it helps us think about, or just interrupts the idea that kids, who they are, their identities, their experiences, their lives outside of school, that actually counts as knowledge.
Yes.
It matters.
Yeah.
And so maybe if we, as practicing teachers too, because this is something that I make the pre-service teachers do in hopes that, like, once they have to do it for an assignment, that it'll become this automatic thing where they notice things about their students that they can interpret.
Well, and what if we let the students lead? Because essentially your standards could be tied into anything.
Yeah.
You talked about the kitchen. I mean, it could be anything from, like, there's math and measurement. There's creativity there. We think that these standards should dictate what we do, but really they can be fit into multiple places. My students will tell you, I'm always like, play the system a little bit, let the students lead, be creative. Teachers are creative. I don't care what they say. Good teachers are naturally creative. They've just been stifled like the children, which I know is a whole nother topic. So I'm not going to go there right now, but that was a great example. And so that's joy, right? Sustaining that sustained fulfillment and not just the reward after the work, right? Just continuing to learn. So thinking about this, if a student learns to read, they do a great job. They reach these benchmarks, but they don't enjoy it, then did we succeed? I think as a whole, we've gotten really good at measuring if a student can do something, but we don't measure whether they want to, or whether they're enjoying it, or whether it's something that's long lasting. And so I think our systems have just come so prioritized on, like, pacing and measurements and outcomes, that we've forgotten the significance of curiosity and exploration and joy, and what kind of adults we're actually creating.
Those things are harder, right? To, like, measure and see.
Yeah, we want to be able to check a box. If we learn to assess differently, like the significance of just observation, and these things would happen naturally. Because I think, and this is an assumption, that teachers want to see students want to learn, that they want to see joy, that they love it when students are curious and ask questions. I get really excited, even with our pre-service teachers who are in college. I get really excited when they love something new. And so there's this like forced control, which there's so much research talking about the reason for schooling and when it started. And are we just looking at reaching these benchmarks? Are we so worried about teacher evaluations that are now tied to these benchmarks, which puts more pressure on the teachers? And then this really had me thinking, you talked a lot about the accountability eras. So, No Child Left Behind, Race to the Top, it's been over and over and over again and just continues in these optimized systems for efficiency, but not for human experience. And I'm thinking about the conditions that exist in this world right now that are so dehumanizing, and how do we build this humanistic experience? And one of the things I was thinking about was this over assessment, and I know we're getting back into assessment again and they all bridge together, so it's going to happen. But I was thinking about when I did the teacher interviews, and we figured out amongst the districts that were interviewed, average was 6 to 9 weeks out of the school year that was tied to assessing, whether it was state assessments, district assessments, 6 to 9 weeks that could have been instruction.
It's a lot of time.
Like, what are we doing? And then we're saying we need longer school days, or do we just need effective school days? That's another question. I shouldn't have even gotten into that. So I just think we've lost this balance in schools of curiosity and that love of learning and why we're learning these things, close these achievement gaps, right? But if we're essentially making students at 7 years old already not like reading, we're not going to close any gaps because they're not going to want to continue to reading. So, we use this word rigor, but is there rigor and joy? Can we find this balance? And this leads into, too, this thought that I've really been exploring about who gets joyful instruction versus who's receiving this more scripted, research-based curriculum because of deficit thinking. This made me think about like these equity dimensions that really aren't being explored enough. There's a few people, and they're in the case notes, Goldie Muhammad, Benita Love. There's a lot of research coming out talking about this need for these topics, these equity dimensions around education. Originally, I used to think it was all like low income, but I do think it's low income, middle class, that we have this deficit thinking and we pour into these programs that we're supposed to use, and children are bored with them and the teachers are bored with them, and it's workbooks and worksheets and slides, so many slides at so many young ages, even though the research says, get in there, developmentally appropriate practice, say hands-on, engaging, children need to move. Right. Especially now, their engagement is so much shorter. We've lost this curiosity, exploration, and joy. So I've really been pondering this concept of the schools that get more joyful, curiosity-based, exploration-based activities and where those are encouraged versus these schools that live within the deficit thinking. And, we're looking for a solution, something to check off the box, something to say, use it with rigor, follow this curriculum to the T. Those are proving to not work. We're not seeing success in those programs. And it reminds me of, I went to a school in another state where there's some big names, children's that go there. And it was this beautiful school where they are outdoor learning and they're exploring, and their food is phenomenal. Like, it's like this fresh, whole cooked foods. They're outside more than they're inside. It's a lot of self-directed, pod-centered learning, but it's expensive. Mm-hmm. And it's definitely not the public education. And I just thought, if more students had opportunities like these, what a difference it would make. And so I'm not saying we just like wipe it all out and we say, we should go to these like free systems. I know you would love that, but I am saying that there should be some leaning into this curiosity, into this joy. I mean, Goldie Muhammad has a great model just for taking what you have and applying it and building on funds and knowledge. She believes in that. So finding these models that build on equity too, I hope that I'm encouraging my teachers to find that, to play this system. I hope they're learning this from us. And this whole concept of whole child development, what that is, whole human development. And this quote from Love is, joy is crucial for social change. Joy in the midst of pain and trauma is the fight to be fully human. A revolutionary spirit that embraces joy, self-care, and love is moving towards wholeness. And isn't that what we want for our children, to all be whole? All of them. And again, I just think this concept of joy, and that just what I've built, like from all these wonderful folks who have continued to define it. I always talked about love of learning, love of learning. And when I heard Goldie Muhammad speak, it like all clicked in. Oh, look at her definition of joy. That's building on what I was thinking, and she gave wonderful words to it. So like, what is the purpose of school? What is the purpose of learning? Are we just teaching academic skills? I mean, is that's schooling?
Mm-hmm.
Don't we want the learning? What is the relationship with learning itself?
So joy isn't this added on thing, right? It shows up when students feel like they're part of, right, the education, or feel like that this experience was designed with them in mind, right? It's not this imposed thing upon them.
If we all are following the same scripted curriculum, how is that built around students?
It makes sense that they're bored.
Yeah.
Right? And that
teachers are bored teaching it. They don't, these teachers that are like, I miss the days where we create. And I mean, I know my first year teaching, I remember our team used to get together and we'd all sit down and we would plan these units together with all these components, and students' names would come up. It'd be like, oh, so and so really likes doing this. Oh, that'd be cool. I wonder if some others, like you'd bring your knowledge of your students right into the fold. My first year teaching, I had a set of twins in my classroom. They were wonderful, wonderful, quiet girls, but they highly intelligent, but they loved reading. I had been building a classroom library for years, and then I continued. And her goal was to read every book in my classroom library. And so they had nothing to do with curriculum. We had all the workbooks and all the things, and they just loved reading. I don't think I realized how much I encouraged students to find books that they enjoyed until I talked to a parent who, I used to say, like, I don't care if they're reading a cereal box, just give them 20 minutes a day. It doesn't have to be complicated. It can be whatever they want. I don't care. And then I recently received a letter from a student who is just doing great things. And it was unexpected. And she thanked me for a couple of things. And one of them in that letter was finding books that she enjoyed reading.
That's awesome.
And I was like, there is no greater gift.
Yeah.
Like I have it like hung up for me to look at, to remind myself. And that was what she remembered. And she didn't say, I remember when you helped me write a paragraph for that assessment. It was like, you found books that I loved reading.
That's funny when you say that. It brought this memory back. And that was one of the best parts about, we did Reader's Workshop for a while, and picking out books for the kids every week. I'd put them in their bin, like when they were first learning how to choose good books and stuff like that. And yeah, I'd pick some at their skill level, but then knowing who they were and what they liked was a part of which books went in the bin for them. Yeah.
And I think that's important,
And they would get excited about, oh, what did she put in the bin this week?
And it's because it's personalized. That's joy, right? Yeah. They were excited to see what did. Yeah. Well, at the time it wasn't Dr. Kelly. Miss Polk. Miss Polk pick out for me. Like, that's amazing. Like, that's what I want for our students to bring to the classroom. So learning does matter. And I want them to want to read, right? I want them to understand the power in reading. And they're forming this identity as learners. And she will learn to read, right? We know they'll learn how, because they'll have to go on. Yeah. But, building and growing from that and understanding the power of text and the joy that comes from text. Even for some of us, like, it was an escape. Reading was an escape for me when I was younger. Those kind of things, not something you have to do, something that you want to do. I do want to say she's doing much better now. She calls me, we talk about books, and her other aunt and I like both bought her books that we thought she'd be interested in. And so we're kind of trying to lean into that. When she comes over here, I always have a stack of books. She likes funny things. So anything that makes her crack up.
Is she liking school?
She is liking school more now, yeah. She is liking a little bit more now. She's very social too, so I think that's a lot of it. It's that third grade age. I FaceTimed her yesterday and she like held up a book and she's like, "Look what I got." I'm like, "Oh my gosh, why do you love that book?" It was the I Survived series. She's like really excited about those. So I was very excited to hear that. And so, what are we producing for learners? Are we intentionally trying to prevent students from wanting to learn, joy in the classroom? There's a lot of attacks on education right now. But I feel for myself that joy as a component, even with our pre-service teachers, is something that can make a difference, make a change.
Let's get those conditions right so that joy can
Yeah,
be there, right? Like they
right.
can feel that. But
Absolutely.
it's complex,
Yeah,
I
yeah.
think
It's very,
joy is just this happy little thing, but it's
yeah,
far more complex than
and it
that.
is a balance. We're not saying that like these systematic ways of teaching aren't important.
No.
We're saying that like that's a perfect example. The boxes, that this or whatever you put them in, basket.
Right, right. We
Yeah,
still taught phonics. We
yeah.
still learned how to read, right? Though, but we also brought
Oh, I
in
want to learn to read because look at this
look at
fun
this book I got.
basket.
Yeah, right.
Like, and Miss Polk put this out for me, and I want to be able to read it, so I'm going to do these things because they let me do this. And how fun is it now that like that's the magic.
There's that connection again, too, that real world connection. We learn this skill to be able to
Yes.
do this thing in real life.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and reading is an essential component of that. And so, just a couple of questions for first teachers or educators to sit with. When was the last time you paused instruction because you saw disengagement? So, the last time that you actually like saw like this is not working, stop. What would it look like to teach the same standard with more joy? So we know you have to, like, we're not saying you have to just like wipe everything out, but how do you work with what you've got? What do you love about teaching? And are your students seeing that love? So does it
That's a
carry
good
over to
question.
them? I think that's important. Administrators, what are we communicating by what we measure? When I know as a principal, when I did walkthroughs, what are you looking for when you're walking through? What are we communicating by what we cut, like recess, art, choice time, when we say those things don't matter?
They're always the first to go, aren't
Yeah.
they?
And so that's a message we're giving. And I know that often as principals, we're not actually the one making those decisions, but how are we supporting our teachers in ways that don't fully remove those? As principals, are we playing the system a little bit? Are we supporting our teachers in doing that? Are teachers empowered to respond to children's joy and curiosity? So as administrators, how do we encourage teachers? Are they having that autonomy, the empowerment? I've heard from teachers who say that if their administrator walks in, they are to be on this thing at this time because that's what everybody's supposed to be on. And if you're not doing that, then you're not what you're supposed to be doing. What does that even mean? Like, how can every classroom be doing exactly the same thing at the same time? I spoke with a teacher who said, you know, they want us to get through the curriculum and pacing matters. So it doesn't even matter if half the class isn't paying attention. You teach to who's learning. I'm like, what year are we
The show
living in?
must go on.
The show, like, what? And then no wonder our teachers are miserable. And then their evaluations are counted towards like it's just this whole mess up
Snowballs, really.
system. And, as administrators, where is your love of learning, right? Like we should still have that in that administrative level. And teacher educators too, are thinking about how are we preparing teachers to create joyful learning? Or are we so focused on here's how you deliver the curriculum with fidelity?
Mhm.
What are we actually doing in our pre-service classrooms to encourage this joy? And what does it look like to teach lesson planning through a joy lens? As pre-service teachers, you look at these lesson plans and you're like, I'm going to be doing this for the rest of my life. I'm like, no, you're building your muscle memory. When you're in a program, you have to think about everything. So you put in all these details, but once you build that muscle memory, it becomes natural. But I'm like, this should be the fun stuff. You're thinking about your classroom. Like, I loved planning. And they all look at me like with foreheads. I'm like, there's something wrong with me. Um, and then, parents, you walk into conference and you're like, oh, are they on grade level? What are their grades? How are they doing? Instead of those questions, what parts of learning do they seem to be really engaged with? What are some favorite things they're doing in the classroom? What have you noticed their interests are? At home, are you encouraging, your child comes home? At what point is your child bringing home something to the kitchen table that you can then encourage? Are you going to the library with your kid to say, hey, you're really into this, let's go get some books and check it out together?
Yeah.
Or let's go for a walk and see if we can find what you're looking for, if it's nature based. So just shifting this. And so I want to hear from some of you, either through our YouTube, you can, comment there, or on our Instagram when we post this. When did you lose joy in learning? And if you didn't, how did you protect it? So how did you protect your love of learning and your joy in your learning? Because stories from all of you matter so much. And understanding what creates and what destroys joy in learning is a very important question in education. We're going to be dissecting this from different angles and getting into the research because when I started preparing for this session, it became so many different components, which I do go down the rabbit hole because I love to learn. So just thinking about some of that. In our show notes, there'll be some resources if you're interested in it as well.
Very good. Well, that was great.
Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you for bringing your moment to us today. And thanks for tuning in with us today and taking a second look. We look forward to seeing you next time.